and disease and illness. Now, we tend to, in America, in Western world, we tend to prioritize science and the medical profession as a completely separate thing. You go to a doctor, you would bring your car to a mechanic for a checkup. But health and wellness and medicine are more complex than just going in for a tune-up like you would with your car. And medical anthropology can be academic, theoretical, and even physiological. But it can also be practical and apply to people's behaviors as well. So it's a biocultural context where disease and illness and wellness can be found. Now, this should be pretty apparent to everybody right now because we're undergoing we're now recently aware of pandemics, right? Now that's a biological, epidemiological thing, and I'm very pleased and happy that there are specialists that deal with viruses and learn how to make vaccines for them. But ultimately, stopping the spread of viruses, stopping the spread of disease is about human behavior. It's not really about the virus. There's viruses out there that will kill you, but we tend to avoid them. We tend to not spread them. So why is this one, or how can we combat coronavirus, COVID-19? By socially distancing, by limiting our certain behaviors where we congregate. That's the sort of understanding that anthropologists, medical anthropologists, biological anthropologists, but also cultural anthropologists can study and help improve the wellness for people. So another thing is that the way that we think about wellness and health varies culture to culture. How illness is thought about in a society isn't necessarily our way of thinking of that is not the only way. Scientific way of thinking about it, of the way illness is socially constructed, diagnosed, managed, and treated, is not uniform. It's not consistent across all cultures. And it's helpful to have some terminology that helps us to break this down into component parts. So the word disease is the word that we use for a scientifically identified health threat. That would be like an ethic version of what an anthropologist would call an illness that might afflict people, is a disease. But an illness is more of an emic perspective. It's a condition of poor health that is perceived by or felt by an individual, right? So an anthropologist would like to identify what disease are they talking about, even if it's hypochondria. That's something that a scientist, the anthropologist, would like to understand from a scientific perspective. But the person who's feeling this may not feel like they may not accept that they have a disease, but they may have a perception of how that illness feels to them. They may feel that they've been cursed, or that some evil eye cast upon them, or there's a spell. Different cultures deal with illness in different ways. And so it helps for an anthropologist to have terminology that can break it down into the emic perspective of that illness and disease, the etic identification from a scientific perspective. This can be very important for stopping the spread of diseases in different cultures. So things like infectious diseases can be exacerbated or spread by the effects of different social constructs. Population growth can affect that. Deforestation, economic development can affect health outcomes. Deforestation can actually affect the contraction of diseases, in fact. And also, this will show unequal distribution of different types of diseases. So anthropologists can even look on a global scale and say, okay, where are we finding these particular afflictions and where do we not find them? What are the causes? What are the possible solutions? And so anthropologists look at three basic causes of illnesses. And those are personalistic disease theories. So this is these are from an emic perspective, right? So what is an illness to somebody? Personalistic disease theory is your concept that your illness is based on agents that are affecting you, like sorcerers, witches, ghosts, ancestral spirits, these sorts of things. Those are personalistic. They're your own internal identification of what that might be, based on your own cultural system that you adhere to. The second one is naturalistic disease theories, which is impersonal terms. This is Western scientific medicine would be included as a naturalistic disease theory. You can talk to somebody who believes in a personalistic disease theory about witches or spirits affecting you, and they may just not care about your so-called disease, your naturalistic disease theory. And then you have emotionalistic disease theories, the third kind, which assumes that emotional experiences cause illnesses. This is a more uncommon circumstance, but things like the evil eye could be associated with that. That it's evil eye is usually not actually associated with someone thinking evil thoughts. It's actually just conjuring up a bad vibe, sort of from maybe envy or tempting fate. Now, that's not to say that we tend to prioritize scientific, naturalistic disease theories, but that's not to say that there aren't some poor outcomes that come from that perspective. And so we can actually turn the mirror on ourselves to look at the way our own concepts of disease and wellness affect us. Scientific medicine is complicit in some problems. That is to say, things like overprescription of certain types of drugs, tranquilizers, narcotics. Unnecessary surgeries are also a complication of scientific medicine. Also, the impersonality and inequality of patient to physicians relationships. That you're really, like I even described it before, you're just a car pulling into the garage and getting your physiology checked out like a tune-up. That tends to cause problems in terms of overall health patterns. And then also overuse of antibiotics, which can produce super bacteria and other types of super pathogens that are resistant to any scientific cures that we might find. So it's not as though our perspective is necessarily a standalone. It also, scientific medicine needs to be understood from a cultural perspective as well, because we're going to have superbugs, we're going to have overprescribed drugs, we're going to have unnecessary surgeries, we're going to have an impersonal relationship and poor health outcomes unless we understand the social aspects of even scientific medicine. But of course, it's biomedicine surpasses non-scientific treatments in some pretty important ways. There's plenty of effective drugs that we've isolated that can treat all sorts of diseases and illnesses. And surgical procedures today are far safer because we have methods that are constantly being refined. And those are more effective than non-biomedical procedures and techniques. Right. So let's get back to anthropology and business, just as a coda to this. because it sort of speaks to the larger idea of applied anthropology. That in a business setting, what you're doing is you're taking broad approach of how do you do anthropology. And that's what you're going to learn in this course. Especially in chapter 13, you'll be able to see some of the methods that anthropologists employ and the theories that help us to understand the data that we collect. But in applied anthropology, you tend to not say, okay, how do humans of all time and all places operate? What are the general rules? And you really want to understand a specific set of circumstances. This is behavioral patterns that we see in what's called micro-enculturation. And so a particular business or a particular health program or a particular governmental policy or for particular development that's taking place. And key features of anthropology that can help enhance our understanding of this micro-enculturation, which is the process by which people learn and particular roles within that limited social system. It's like a box. And anthropology can help us through methods of ethnography, the ethnographic method, but also cross-cultural comparisons. How do we see this business behave? How does this differ? And then a focus on cultural diversity. An acceptance that cultures are relative to one another and that certain behaviors fit within that context. And if you take that behavior out of that context, you can misunderstand it. So this is where, like I said, in a business world, if you've got an international corporation, you want to understand the way a particular behavior is going to be perceived outside of that context. Let me give you an example, going back to the Japan versus American workplaces. Anthropologists have investigated workplace cultures for a long time, and it's generally considered that corporate culture and actually employment culture in Japan tends to be, and actually culture in general in Japan tends to be more communally minded. And in America, it tend to be more libertarian, more individualistic, more personal and personal successes rather than group successes. Now, in a Japanese corporation, for instance, if you want a promotion, if you want to succeed and do well at your job, the best you can do for yourself is to make yourself not stand out. Someone who stands out as doing a different job, maybe above and beyond the person next to them, actually is not doing their job. Your job is to fit a function. You're a cog in a mechanism. And if you stand out at all, then you are actually not functioning properly. Whereas in America, we tend to be much more individualistic. You want to actually say, no, I'm way better than that other person down there. You need to look at me and raise your hand up and say, look at me, look at me. Now, could you imagine going to being an American in a Japanese context where you stand up and flail your arms and say, look how special and important I am? You would look like the squeaky wheel. You would look like the broken cog. And you would probably not succeed very well in that environment. Likewise, a Japanese person coming to an American environment would just keep getting on with their work and never be recognized, never be noticed, and may actually be downsized because they don't see the utility in them. They're not advancing, they're not doing better. So this is where corporate cultures need to be understood on their own terms. And in terms of its broader cultural impact, but also in the micro-enculturation of an individual company. So that's all I want to talk about in terms of chapter 3. I'll see you for the next chapter then.